It is on. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our MCSHE seminar today. Those who don't know me, my name is Dr. Mahmoud Sarkar. I'm a senior lecturer of Monash Center for Scholarship in Health Education here at Monash. And I also work half of my time for Monash Education Academy as an academic development specialist. And where I actually met Tim, I'll talk more about that. But before we go there, I'd like to acknowledge the country, acknowledge the traditional owners of these lands on which we live and work, and pay our respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. And we are very delighted to have Associate Professor Tim Bonds to present this seminar for us. For my other work at Monash Education Academy, Tim is my colleague, and we have lots of chats about, technology and its role in education. And we have some similarities in terms of background. That's why we can have lots of informal chats about health education, education research. And during the conversation, I thought Tim would be a very thoughtful presenter for MCSHE to talk about clinical education and the role of technology in education, which is Tim's background and expertise. And Tim recently moved to Monash from the University of Edinburgh with lots of expertise in the role of artificial intelligence in education. And he is considered as a national expert at this moment in Australia. He is doing lots of seminars and workshops for many universities across the nation. So it is great. So I'll hand over this session to Tim. And Tim, you can share your slides.
Thanks, Mahbub. Thank you very much for having me. I've written incorrectly there because I seem to be positioned as some kind of expert in generative artificial intelligence, but I shouldn't be. Anyway, so thank you for having me. It's an honor to be talking and great to be invited, Mahbub. As Mahbub said, we have lots of good conversations over in the Monash Education Academy about all things teaching and learning, but I came over from the University of Edinburgh from the department, well, not the department, the section of clinical education. I was teaching on an online postgraduate program in clinical education there with many students. I think there was over 300 students at the time that I left. So all of those students were or are clinical educators. So teaching the teachers kind of situation. And then in January, I started as an education-focused associate professor at the Monash in the Monash Education Academy, where again, we're kind of teaching the teachers, although I suppose the word teaching needs to be quite loosely understood in that context. So anyway, let me make sure that I am able to share my slides. Can you see that, Mahbub?
Perfect, Tim.
Great. I will also make sure that I can see the clock so that I don't overrun. So my plan is to talk for a little while and then allow plenty of time for Q&A.
Yeah, yeah.
Thanks. And if people want to interrupt me while I'm talking, I'm fine with that. I don't know whether it's easy for me to see the chat. Let me just, yes, I can see the chat. Or Mahbub can let me know if someone wants to ask something, that's fine, or we can leave it to the end.
Sure, I will let you know, Tim.
Yeah, thanks. I'm quite an informal presenter, so feel free. So I put this slide, for some reason, quite taken with Greg the mechanic. I've used him in the last couple of presentations, so apologies if you've seen him before. I've called this Entangled Pedagogy, Complexity and Post-Digital Education, which is a big mash of difficult-looking words, but I will talk you through it and it'll all be okay. And I had this note to say, none of this presentation was written by AI. And then I started thinking, well, I don't know if that's right, because actually there's all sorts of autocomplete going on and it's embedded in Microsoft products and Google products. And So maybe some of it kind of has been written by AI. And so I then said, well, not intentionally. And then I thought, well, what is intentional? And then I thought maybe it's not intentionally by me. Maybe some of the intention is in the minds of the people who created the AI or embedded it into Microsoft Word or whatever. And then thought, well, then I did sort of intentionally use those technologies. And anyway, maybe that's a very difficult question to answer. Was any of this written by AI, and was it intentional? Not really sure. So as you'll see when I go through this, the lines between things become quite blurry, and I'm not a fan of dichotomies or binaries. You know, this is or this is not AI, this is or this is not technology. This is a talk that is grounded in research, and that research, a lot of it has taken place in a clinical education context, but it's not really a research talk. It's more of a talk about the way that I understand the intersection between technology and education, which is from a complex view, because I think if we understand this in a complex way, then it gives us more agency and opportunities to think about how we design educational interventions, how we orchestrate them, and how we respond to what's going on at the time. So I also want to, if I can move my slides along, I also want to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations, on the traditional owners of the land from which I speak, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And as I like saying at the moment, it's really useful to think about the knowledge traditions that we are situated in, and the long history of learning and knowledge that shows us that all this stuff that seems really new at the moment isn't all new, and that what is new has to be kind of embedded in the old. It's not like new knowledge comes in and steamrolls over what was there before. I'd like to start with a little provocation, because we're going to kind of come around to this question of generative artificial intelligence, which is not what the talk is about, but it gives us a kind of a framing of all the things that I want to say about technology and digital technology in general. So to start with, during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is still ongoing, but during the move to online that many people had to do, there was a widespread desire to compare online learning with face-to-face or on-campus learning. But this kind of comparison has a long history, going back decades. And many people have tried to do what we call media comparison study of online learning versus face-to-face, for example, or technology 1 versus technology 2, or modality 1 versus modality 2. And assuming that people have designed and run their studies effectively with a reasonable methodology, they almost invariably come out as no significant difference. So online, there's no significant difference between the outcomes of online learning and face-to-face learning, irrespective of the context. And there's a website called the No Significant Difference Phenomenon, which documents thousands of these studies that have been done over decades. And the reason that there's no significant difference isn't that there's no difference between online learning and face-to-face learning, but that the difference within the categories is more important than the difference between the categories. So you can do all manner of things under the umbrella of face-to-face learning or on-campus learning. There's a hugely diverse category of stuff. Online learning is the same. You can do a huge range of different things and call them online learning. And so what actually matters more is the skills of people, the things that they do, the suitability of that approach to the particular students in front of you, what we are trying to learn, and that sort of thing. So this is partly a plea to say, don't bother doing media comparison studies. There's much more interesting studies to do, and also a plea to say, we can't make blanket claims about a whole modality like online learning or on-campus learning, because it's hugely diverse, and the kind of temptation that we have to homogenize everything into these big categories, it makes it easy for us. It makes it easy to talk about things, but it also means that we miss almost everything that's interesting about the category that we have presented as homogeneous. So here's this is my most popular tweet ever from a few years ago. I think it was probably 2020 when everyone was struggling with online learning and saying, okay, there is such a thing as a Zoom class that many people were focused on. But if we look under the surface of what's required, then there are all these things that people need to do: preparing, designing, evaluating, having ongoing conversations and longitudinal community building, and then professional development that's related to the uses of technology in teaching, and actually going all the way to advocating for resources and changes to infrastructure and policy that allow us to support the different ways that we want to enact education. And so you can see that you couldn't make much inference about the quality of online learning from what happens in the Zoom class, because it really is contingent on all of these things that happen under the surface. There's a paper from a little while ago, colleagues from Edinburgh, around the way that I understand the evaluation of teaching, and especially teaching in relation to technology. And it was a kind of resistance to the use of, well, not the use of data, but the over-reliance of data in terms of evaluation. So we might be talking about student satisfaction surveys. We might be talking about learning analytics that evaluate the effectiveness of approaches of students. We might be thinking of just simple numbers that define the quality of teaching, and actually talking about how the quality of teaching and learning is ecological. It's contingent on an interdependence of many factors, which include the students and the teachers and the infrastructure and the educational stakeholders. So teachers aren't responsible for the quality of a student's education. Students aren't responsible for the quality of the student's education. Institutions aren't. It's all of these things in combination. And so we need to actually think about all of those different elements and also their interrelations in order to understand and improve quality of education. So here's this the start framing of generative artificial intelligence. We might ask a question like, will generative artificial intelligence revolutionize education? And I will come around to say, well, no, not by itself. It depends. Anyway, so hold that in your mind, and then I'll take you through a little journey and come back to it. Here are some statements that I don't really like, and I'll talk about why I don't like them. So real world learning as opposed to online learning, for example. Why isn't online part of the real world? You can't, there isn't a real world and a different world. Everything is part of the real world, or nothing is. In person, if I'm doing online teaching or online learning, I still feel like I am in person. I haven't left my person. I still am an embodied human, and I still have physical constraints and affordances, and I still matter, and I still am made of matter. Face-to-face is a strange concept as a distinction from online learning, given that, you know, I'm looking at Mahbub's face now and he's probably looking at mine. It's still face-to-face. So these terms I find problematic because they carry assumptions about what online learning is and what mediation through digital technology is. And I think we need a more complex and nuanced approach. A thing that I hear often is something to do with young people understanding technology or wanting technology or needing more technology as a way of driving the integration of technology into educational practice. And probably the most prominent version of this is the digital natives rhetoric, that young people are digital natives. They've grown up with technology around them, therefore they understand it and need it. Again, we're homogenizing an enormously broad category of people, young people. I don't know. I think at the time, Mark Prensky mentioned a certain age at which you stopped being a digital native and became a digital immigrant, which becomes more and more ridiculous over time, because, you know, at what point the people who were digital natives then at some point will be talking about the same thing, that young people understand technology in a way that they don't. And yet people are very diverse. People have diverse conditions, diverse access to technology. And an anecdote that I quite like is at a family gathering a few years ago, there were two kids, aged 10 and 12, and they'd been watching Netflix during this family gathering, and then their parents said, could they stop doing that and come and join everybody? And they didn't do it. And eventually somebody turned the TV off at the wall, so at the power socket. And I watched these two kids spend a full 10 minutes trying to figure out how to turn the TV back on and never going anywhere near the power socket. And so this is just an analogy to show you that it might look in certain ways that young people are very au fait or very competent with technological interfaces, but there are always different levels and different aspects to technology and technological understanding, and they all matter. And actually, it's more a contextual thing that designates how someone understands technology rather than an age thing. And people in different countries will have different considerations, etc. So we need to resist this kind of homogenizing idea of blanket statements about what technology is or what categories of people can do or do prefer, etc. The other one is online learning doesn't work for my subject, and that's probably more contentious because I'm sure that's a strongly held view by a lot of people. Medicine, for example, I've heard people say that you can't teach medicine online. Now, this will need a bit more explanation, so I'm going to go into the next part of the talk, which is talking about post-digital education and the idea that online learning isn't really online, and therefore you can actually learn anything online if you think of online as the kind of starting point, the base camp of a course or a program from which you can go out into the world. I forgot about this slide, so let me just say here's a couple of statements that I do like before I go on to the post-digital thing, which is, I don't think technology enhances learning or makes people stupid. I think it depends on the conditions in which it happens. So before generative artificial intelligence, we had worries about Google making people stupid. We had worries about Facebook making people stupid. We also had worries about the printing press and the invention of writing making people stupid. And it's not that these things had no consequence on the way people think. It's that it really is contingent on the ways in which people do things and the conditions in which they happen and the entanglement of new technologies which have to be integrated into what's already there. The other statement I quite like is that technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. So it definitely has an effect, but it doesn't have an inherent good or bad effect. It depends, and we'll get onto more detail. So the history of this paper, which for me has had quite a big influence on my research and scholarship, is that the editor of a new journal called Postdigital Science and Education, Peter Jandrich, asked me to write a paper for his new journal for the first issue. And in order to do so, I had to work out what post-digital meant. And so I went away and I had a think. And in the end, where I came to resonated with my career history. I started out as a learning technologist in the Department of Clinical Psychology at the University of Edinburgh. And I had the word e-learning in my title. So I was an e-learning developer, and I always struggled with that because I couldn't work out what e-learning was. It seemed that people thought e-learning was stuff that you did online, probably self-paced course in which you interacted with a digital interface and learned stuff. But I couldn't understand what the E meant, because learning seemed to be the same. Learning was just learning. It didn't happen in a specific place. It just was the same as if you learned in a classroom. And the E bit was, okay, there is probably a computer involved here, or a computer chip, or maybe an internet connection. But does it have to be there all the time? Because a lot of e-learning activities seem to ask you to go and read something which you might print out on paper and do, or you'd go and talk to people about in a cafe, or you would walk around and think about. So I couldn't work out the difference between e-learning and learning, and there was no meaningful difference to me in the way that you separated something that was and wasn't e-learning, especially as technology, digital technology, was more and more integrated into classroom practice. So the way that I came to post-digital was, it's not a time period that happens after a digital revolution or something. It's just an acknowledgement that anything that's digital is always also social and material. It's always embedded in the world, and that really all education these days is to some extent digital, to some extent social, to some extent material, and those things all interact. So this paper was an argument to say there's online learning doesn't happen online because you can go away from a computer screen and continue learning and it's the same program. And that in classrooms, the fact that there is digital technology shapes the way that you engage. So even, your classroom experience is probably to some extent involving digital technologies, but even if someone banned digital technologies from a classroom, the fact that you can look at stuff before the class and the fact that you know that you can go and look things up after the class changes the way that you engage at the time. So even then, the digital is still entangled in what you're doing. And in the bottom right-hand corner is just a plug that say that from that first paper, quite a lot of things happened, including the publication of an edited volume of post-digital work by many good people around postgraduate education. So it was a big journey between that first paper and where I got to. One of the important points of this post-digital view is that technology never steamrollers over everything. You don't bring it in as an independent thing. It always has to become embedded into existing practices for students and teachers and institutions. So there's always technology already there that it has to connect to. There's always traditions and cultures and standards and ways of doing things that the new technology has to kind of be embedded in. And you can think of the last time they brought in a new virtual learning environment where you are, or the last time they brought in some new system, it didn't suddenly come into a blank slate. It had to fit in with all the things that you already did and all the systems that were already there. On online teaching, the move to online that many people experienced during COVID lockdowns was really fraught, was really difficult. And people were kind of annoyed by this, and they blamed a lot of the poor quality teaching on the fact that it was online. But what I think some people didn't realize was that you kind of have to learn new ways of teaching for new contexts. So this is a paper that my team in Edinburgh published a while ago, and it was based on perceptions of the ways that people develop their teaching over time while learning about education. And we did a thematic analysis and broke it into these four categories: repertoire building, perspective shifting, embodied practice, and appreciation of context. So if you think about the move from classroom to online, there's a whole repertoire of teaching approaches that people need to build up in order to feel comfortable and confident and have a versatility in the online context. A perspective shifting in the way that they understand how education works. Now, you might have already had a perspective that would encompass that for online teaching, but I think a lot of people did not, because you could get away with quite a lot of atheoretical work in a classroom just due to the long history and tradition. But when you're in online, you kind of need to have this perspective of what counts as education. So the sort of thing that I've been talking about a lot is that learning doesn't just happen during scheduled activities, but it continues on afterwards. And so we need to think of teaching, I would argue, as a way of kind of punctuating these longer asynchronous journeys that students are on. And what that means is trying to help students make connections, social connections with each other and conceptual connections with things that people learn beforehand and will go on to learn afterwards. And that's very different from saying between 10 and 11 on a Tuesday, these students need to learn A, B, C, and D. Embodied practice is just developing habits and patterns that will fit with the context that we're in. So in online teaching, there are very different physical considerations that people need to take into account when teaching and of the learners. And there are different skills and habits that you pick up. Just imagine, you know, the fact that I can share my screen quite simply with you now is quite different from the first time I tried to do it, where it probably didn't go very smoothly. So there's a lot of habits that we need to pick up, and they you can argue that they're technical skills, but I think it's more than that. They're kind of situated ways of doing things in a context. And then appreciation of context is kind of going beyond this is a method and this is a technology and this is how I use it, to thinking this is the environment in which we're doing things and this is how that matters to the way that I do them. So these different ways, I think, show us why online teaching was hard for people who had to switch very quickly, because there's actually a whole lot of things that need to be relearned for that new context. It's also the case that technology can be quite fraught, that bringing in a technology can be quite different and can make things quite challenging. So this is a bit of research that I did with Sven, who was in Rotterdam, University of Rotterdam, and we looked at the United Kingdom College of Royal Surgeons practice exams, and I think it was the year 2021, they used online proctoring, and we had a look at what does that do? Is it the same as in-room invigilated examinations? And to some extent it was, and to some extent it was different. So the things that were different was that we found that it had a tighter script, a tighter behavioral script. Candidates had to sit very still. They had to look directly at a screen for a number of hours. They had to use cameras to scan their bedroom or wherever they were doing the exam from to make sure that there were no resources. So the possibility of accessing other people or resources in order to know things was more heavily restricted in online proctoring in a behavioral sense than an invigilated exam or in a physical exam center. Because when you go to a physical exam center, you're checked when you go in, and then you kind of a bit freer to act and interact. Also, there is a strange change to trust relations, because in an online proctored sense, often you have someone who is watching you, but you can't see them. So it's a one-way mirror, if you like. And there are ways of being flagged that are driven by artificial intelligence. For example, if I look up, then I might be flagged as potentially suspicious behavior, and there's a sort of a strange potential damaging of trust relations. What's the same is that these are embedded in historical contexts of invigilation in exams. So online proctoring has that same kind of political drive to assure and accredit trustworthy examinations of medical practitioners. But there's also a strange economic entanglement going on here, where the framing of candidates as potential cheaters is in the interests of the companies that produce proctoring technology, so that they want to fuel this hype around an apparently growing problem of cheating in order to present the solution to that problem as their product. But the strange thing about proctoring technologies and any kind of anti-cheating technologies is the worst thing they could do for themselves is actually solve cheating. That what they need to do is exacerbate the hype and the rhetoric around this growing problem of cheating, so that they can sell their product and apparently solve the problem, which they actually don't want to solve. So there are all these complicated things around technology, but you can see also that the context in which these technologies come in are highly influential to the way that the technology is used and received. And here we come to a more recent bit of work that I did, which was actually, interestingly, or perhaps not interestingly, depending on your view, but to me, interestingly, was really supposed to be a stepping stone to something else, but it grew So I was trying to write a paper about what I thought was important in online teaching, and I needed to kind of convey a theoretical framework in order to make some arguments, and then the theoretical framework became this paper, and it kind of grew arms and legs. I'll talk you through this table in order to explain. Oh, I've clicked on the wrong thing. What did I say before about problematic screen sharing? Hang on a sec.
We all love technology, team. Don't worry.
Yeah, there we go. Here we go. So let me not click that. Yeah, I'll talk you through this table, which is my view of the way that the relationship between technology and pedagogy works. So on the left, I've labeled this as an illusion, is the idea that technology can drive pedagogy. And to me, this is a technological determinist view of technology, where technology is the driver of change. And it can convey an essentialist view of technology, where technology embodies particular pedagogical principles, or it can convey an instrumentalist view of technology, where technology are neutral tools which teachers can use to their own ends. From this view, teacher doesn't have much agency because the tools predict the outcomes, and all you need to do is choose and correctly use tools, and they will enact the change that is promised by the technology. Another illusion, I think, is this statement that pedagogy can drive technology. And this is something I've heard quite a lot in response to people's worries about technology coming in and shaping the way they do education. So people will often say pedagogy has to drive technology, or we need to put pedagogy first, which I sympathize with. I understand where people are coming from when they say that, but I think it's an illusion. I don't think it can actually work that way. I think that this is a type of pedagogical determinism, which suggests that educators can be the drivers of change. And I think it conveys an instrumentalist view of technology, where you can use technology however you want to achieve your purposes. So from this view, I think the teacher has a lot of agency, and that their skill and the methods that they use predict the outcomes, and that their skill really involves choosing good methods and using tools effectively in relation to those methods. So what do I think is actually the case? This third column, I think that rather than one thing driving another thing, I think that there is a mutual shaping of many different things. And I've broken it into purpose, context, values, methods, and technology. So purpose is, what are we trying to achieve here? And there are often multiple purposes, some of which differ across stakeholders. Teachers might have different purposes from students. We have context, which is all the sort of background stuff that influences the way that things come together and happen. Values, which is what we care about, what matters to us. And again, there are multiple values going on, and some of them might be in tension. And then there are teaching and educational methods and technologies. So here I understand technology not as isolated things, but as always multiple. So an example that I like to use is a car. A car is a technology, but it's made of other technologies. It's made of headlights and engines and wheels and car seats, etc. And even then, it's still reliant on other technologies, such as a road and traffic infrastructure and driving licenses and all of that sort of thing. So it only makes sense as multiple. It's contextual in the sense that it makes sense in relation to, like, the fact that we are in Australia or Victoria, for example, if you're me, which means that my understanding of the way that cars work is slightly different from somebody else. But also I don't know, all of the kind of things that I'm not focusing on at the moment that matter to this are part of the way that this technology is realized. It's relational in the sense that it and I are really the thing that is going on, rather than it in isolation of me, or Marbup and I and this Zoom technology is really what's happening here, rather than the Zoom by itself. here, agencies negotiated between different things, including educators and technology, students and policy and infrastructure. So nobody has full agency. It's all a kind of entanglement of things that we negotiate with the partial agency that we have. And the outcomes, whatever happens, I really do know something about technology, I promise. The outcomes that happen are contingent on all these complex relations of things coming together. And what I'm calling skill here, or might call knowledge, is in the configuration of the things that you have some control over, and the way that we design education and orchestrate it, and the practices that we develop. I've added a fourth column, which I'm calling aspirational. And it's not that, so the third column is what I think is the case, and the fourth column is where I think we might go from there in order to better operationalize this actual view. So I've said, let's emphasize purpose, context, and values over methods and technology. I don't think these things are hierarchical, so I don't think that purpose, context, and values are more important than methods and technology, but I do think methods and technology are easier to see, they're easier to take notice of, and it's easier to forget about and neglect purposes, context, and values. And that's why I think we might want to emphasize those. I think teachers or educators and students should collaborate on the design and practice of education because of the need to negotiate agency. So if we're thinking actually the outcomes and the agency are negotiated between all these people, then the best thing we can do is collaborate. And because things are contingent on complex relations, it means outcomes are uncertain. And therefore embracing that uncertainty and being open to the imperfection, because nobody has total control, and openness to help us negotiate with people, and honesty about where we're fallible, what we do and don't know, that sort of thing, will probably ultimately help that negotiation. I'm hoping. I realize I'm slightly idealistic. And that knowledge in this entangled sense is distributed, and it's responsive, and it's ethical. So it's distributed across people and technologies and policy and infrastructure, etc. It's responsive to the emergent thing that's actually going on in front of us. And it's ethical in the sense that if we want to know what the implications of different integrations of technology are, then we need to trace the actual emergent things that happen in relation to those integrations. So I realize that's complex, and that was the hardest bit of the talk, and I'll move on now to what I promised to come back to, which was generative AI, not because I am an expert and not because I know what everyone should do, but because I feel like on the basis of all that theoretical stuff that I've just talked about, we might want to think, what does that mean for generative artificial intelligence? Because it's very tempting to think, okay, ChatGPT will revolutionize education, or maybe this is a case in which technology drives pedagogy. I don't think so, and I'm happy to discuss that with you more. But what I want to say is that if we think about an entangled view of generative artificial intelligence, then it isn't that ChatGPT comes in and changes everything. It's that we already have a context in which certain things are valuable to us, and that we need to think about those in relation to the way that something like ChatGPT or any other generative artificial intelligence technology will become integrated into our educational landscape. So if you're me, then you would argue that we already had certain values and principles of assessment in higher education, for example, that were difficult to enact, that we needed to move towards. And that this has kind of accelerated that need that was already there. I think it would look very different if we had a different education system and generative artificial intelligence became widely available. We need to think about the other technologies that are already in play, and the policies and the way that we value particular types of learning outcomes and that sort of thing. And we need to think about them all together rather than panicking and reacting just to generative artificial intelligence. So for example, if you went and revised all of your assessments to be ChatGPT proof, you might forget about the purpose of what you were trying to do in the first place with your program. You might forget about some of the values that you cared about. You might forget about the context. What are your students? What are the conditions they're in? What access to technology do they have? What discipline are they studying? What are the accreditation requirements, etc.? I've put in a couple of papers. I'm nearly at Q&A. You'll be relieved to know. I put in a couple of papers that I think are worth thinking about here. The first one is called Evaluative Judgment of Working Practices. And here, with Clara O'Shea at Edinburgh, I argued that we think a lot about assessment products and performances. And sometimes we think about assessing process, which is a popular idea in response to generative artificial intelligence. But I think we also want to try and assess, not necessarily summative, but expose to teachers and students in order to generate feedback on them. I think we want to assess practices, which is basically the ways of getting work done. So here we might think, okay, let's go with ChatGPT as an example. It isn't just one technology. It depends on how a particular student or teacher uses it and the patterns of practice that they develop around it. So what we want to do here is understand how it is actually being used by different students differently, bring that out into the open, have discussions around it, and help everyone see what's good and bad about those particular practices and how we might use them to improve not just the doing of assessment tasks, but learning as well. So thinking about what is it that people actually do with these technologies? How do they integrate them with other technologies? How does that use change over time? How does that relate to learning? And think about it from this kind of complex and heterogeneous way. The other paper that I've mentioned is Seamful Learning in Professional Education, in which we talk about the fact that professional education, like healthcare education, isn't really just preparing people to cross a bridge from an academic setting to a practice setting, from theory to practice, from university to the workplace. Actually, they're a negotiation of multiple contexts at the same time. So when you are in medical school, for example, you're also overlapping with medical practice in important ways. And when you're in medical practice, you're overlapping with academic practice in certain ways. So you're always in a practice setting. It's just that you are trying to negotiate multiple contexts at the same time, and educators and students knit these different contexts together through ad hoc practices, which we call seams in this paper. And we want to think about the way in which, when we're talking about artificial intelligence, we want to think about not just what does it look like from an academic perspective where people have to demonstrate certain kinds of knowledge, and not just what do we think artificial intelligence will look like in the workplace, but we need to kind of work about ways of negotiating the tensions and the gaps between those two things. That's a bit of a complex idea, but essentially what we're trying to do is think beyond how can I ChatGPT proof my assessment, and think more in terms of the situated application of technology, both in the practices that students use when they're doing the work of assessment, and also in relation to the kinds of learning and things that we think are valuable, getting back to the idea of purposes and values. So here I am, you'll be very relieved. So Catalin is saying, provide a short definition for the term postdigital. So my definition, and this is not necessarily everyone's definition, is that any education is postdigital in the sense that it's influenced by digital activity, but that digital activity is not separate from social activity and material activity. So it's always this complex, interrelated digital, social, material activity at the same time. Mahbub, I'll finish there and then we can go to Q&A if you're happy.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tim. So I have to think a lot about, what I mean by technology and its role in education. So we'll have lots of conversations in future. I can see that. But the floor is now open for questions.